From CBS 47 and Fox 30, it's time for This Week in the 904.
Welcome to This Week in the 904. I'm your host, Emily Turner. This is a community affairs show. We focus on politics, public policy, and the issues that really affect our local communities here. And joining us today is Lisa Rinaman. You are the St. John's Riverkeeper, an important title and an important job.
Well, thank you. Good morning.
Yes. And so when it comes to some of the, let's just start with the condition of the St. John's River. What is it now, and what does it look like moving forward?
Sure. You know, the St. John's River, it's a huge river. And so, luckily there are good things. There's some improvements on some of the health of the St. John's, but there's also growing stress on our St. John's River. And so things we need to address. One of the things we've been able to do is reduce nitrogen pollution in the St. John's using the Clean Water Act and other tools over the last 25 years. But we're seeing that being offset with other things that are undermining the river's health, like increase in phosphorus levels, which also can trigger those toxic blue-green algal outbreaks, which we're seeing some right now, which is really early in the season. So that combined with saltwater intrusion and others, there's still a lot of work to be done to save the St. John's River.
Phosphorus that's a pesticide or fertilizer offset?
Yeah, it comes from fertilizer, comes from urban fertilizer as well as from agriculture, but also from wastewater treatment facilities. One of the biggest threats right now is our state is permitting South Florida to send their biosolids, which is a pretty fancy word for sewage sludge, to the headwaters of the St. John's. And when they do that, when you put it on land for farmers to fertilize their grass crops, it does provide a lot of nitrogen, but it provides way too much phosphorus, and all that's running off in the St. John's, and it's undermining the river's health all the way up here in Northeast Florida.
When it comes to salinity, I mean, we can say, where does that come from? Obviously the ocean, but what's happening there? How are we getting saltwater intrusion?
Sure, it's coming in a couple different ways. The St. John's River is a spring-fed river, and so we're seeing a reduction of spring flow. So then when there's less fresh water going into the river, since the river is so flat, it's actually offset by incoming Atlantic Ocean, more the Atlantic Ocean coming further in. In addition, we've been dredging and straightening and widening the St. John's River for more than 100 years. That gives the Atlantic Ocean more tidal force to come further inland, pushing that saltwater intrusion further. And then sea level rise is just adding more insult to injury. And so it's just providing more and more saltwater going further upstream.
And why is that a negative? Why does that have a negative impact?
Sure. So it's actually a couple ways. One of the things that we're really concerned about, it's literally burning and killing submerged aquatic vegetation. And SAV for short, these grasses, they're the kidneys of the river. And if you don't have your kidney function, your river can eventually die. It's also critical habitat for our recreational and commercial fisheries. And so it's really important to the fishing community, our economy, as well as the health of the St. John's River.
How have you seen that change? I mean, what is the salinity, the increase in salinity, how does that manifest itself over time?
So we used to have healthy eelgrass and freshwater grasses in the St. John's and Duval County. You're not seeing them in Duval County. It's very seasonal in clay in St. John's County. We're literally seeing burned trees or ghost trees like our submerged cypress trees that are getting burned, and those freshwater swamps are going to eventually get offset with salt marsh. And you really need to have your saltwater system, your estuary, there's a mix of salt and fresh all together, because different species that live in the St. John's, they need different saltwater regimes for different parts of their life cycle. Like the blue crab. Our blue crab, which is our #1 commercial catch in the St. John's, they need fresh water as part of their life cycle, and then they actually go out into the Atlantic Ocean. So if you have those systems further and further apart, there'll be a significant drop in blue crab as well as other species that live in the river.
It's interesting you say that, because growing up on the river kind of on the south side, I remember seeing so many manatees there and never seeing a dolphin. And then it's wild, it's the opposite way, where they're further and further upriver, I guess.
Absolutely. And when we have droughts like we've been recently having, you see more and more saltwater go further in. And so as you'll see more dolphins going further in. And so it's just something that our river's out of balance. The salt freshwater regime that needs to happen to have a healthy estuary is just not in check right now. And we're seeing devastating effects, including about 90% of our eelgrass was lost after Hurricane Irma, and it hasn't recovered yet. And we're many years out.
How do we fix that?
Well, there's several things. One, there's not a silver bullet. If there was a silver bullet, it would be much easier, but there's many things we need to do. One of the things we found that as the river gets saltier, our eelgrass, those submerged grasses, they need more light And so we need to do things that allow more light to get into the river. Like when we have these toxic blue-green algal outbreaks, that blocks light. When we have sedimentation issues with dirt going into the river, that blocks light. And so we need to do anything we can to just keep the river clear. It's supposed to look like iced tea, not coffee, and to make sure that we're keeping it crystal clear so that these grasses are getting the light they need, and also reducing saltwater intrusion.
And when it comes to that, you said it's a balance between the saltwater and freshwater. I mean, that freshwater comes from the springs. How many springs feed the St. John's? What does that process look like for it to get downriver?
Sure. So there's more than 100 freshwater springs that provide the St. John's that critical freshwater. Most of those are in Central Florida. And what we're seeing is a development explosion continuing in Central Florida. And so in that part of the state, they're literally using more of our drinking water, our aquifer water, which is our drinking water source, as well as the source for the springs. They're overtapping. And so we're seeing that reduction of fresh water in our spring flow, and that directly impacts the health of the St. John's.
There's been a fight over protecting springs lately. What is the status of that?
Sure, there's been an ongoing fight. In fact, just recently, we're part of the Florida Springs Council, so we work on litigation to help protect our springs. And there was fantastic legislation years ago that actually protected our outstanding Florida springs and required the state to protect them at a higher degree. Unfortunately, the state's not doing that at the moment, and the judge ruled with them that they didn't have to have that extra layer of protection, but we'll be back in court and take that on appeal, because we do believe our river is only as healthy as our springs, and our springs are critical to not only our water resources in the state of Florida, but also our tourism and economy, because it's basically a window into our aquifer.
Exactly. Well, there's so much more to talk about when it comes to freshwater and springs, and we'll talk about that as well as some of the development that's happening on the St. John's River. We'll be back right after this.
From CBS 47 and Fox 30, you're watching This Week in the 904.
Welcome back to This Week in the 904. I'm your host, Emily Turner. I am joined by the St. John's Riverkeeper, Lisa Rinaman. We were talking about freshwater versus saltwater in our springs, but one of the major issues that's kind of been on the table is the Rodman Dam and breaching that. For folks who have no idea, because, I mean, who knew? Right. Where is it, what is it, and what is it you're looking to do?
Sure. In 1968, the largest tributary to the St. Johns River, the Ocklawaha River, was dammed as part of the failed Cross-Florida Barge Canal. The Rodman Dam was put in place basically on this tributary to backfill the canal to allow the locks and the ships to be able to get through. In 1972, President Nixon, he killed the canal program, but the dam was already in place. And that dam is located in kind of south of Palatka in the Willaca area. The tributary of the Ocklawaha, it meets the St. Johns River 100 miles inland from the mouth of the St. Johns, right at the beginning of the St. Johns River estuary. Historically, the Ocklawaha River really balanced out the salt freshwater regime in the St. Johns because it's mostly spring-fed. And so when the Ocklawaha is flowing freely, the St. Johns River gets much more spring, crystal clear water, cooler water, fresher water than when it does when it's dammed. Because now as it's dammed, that water sits behind in a pool and it kind of festers. And so by the time it gets to the St. Johns River, it's only about 50% of the flow. In addition, it's the water quality and the chemistry is not as fresh as it would be if it was a spring-fed flowing river naturally into the St. Johns.
How much water are we talking about here? Like just a few hundred gallons or far more than that?
Significant. So the St. Johns River Water Management District and other federal and state agencies have studied the impacts of restoration for more than 20 years, and they estimate conservatively on average about 150 million gallons of fresh water would be restored to the St. Johns River every single day. You also will restore about 8,000 acres of forested wetlands and floodplain, so provide more resiliency and floodplain restoration, flood protection, and you get the biofiltration from those freshwater swamps that currently the system does not have. And so it is one of the most important things to restore the St. Johns River estuary, as well as this submerged aquatic vegetation that literally put Northeast Florida on the map as the bass fishing capital of the world.
And that's under threat because their habitat, seagrass is basically
it's disappearing. It's disappearing. And it's the freshwater restoration is a big piece of that, to making sure that we have those freshwater grasses, not only for today, but for generations to come.
Where does that process stand?
So one of the focuses that we have been working on as St. John's Riverkeeper is working with the local community to focus on what could be gained instead of what will be lost, and really looking at the benefits of restoration and working literally in the river, working with anglers, working on what the St. John's River needs, what it's telling us. And we're seeing a significant shift in opinion as far as restoration. But there are still people that are, dedicated to, keeping the pool behind the dam, which I understand. If I grew up fishing on that pool, I would want to protect it as well. But when you look at the economics, you look at the science, every single day that dam is in place, it's doing damage to the St. John's, as well as 20 Springs and Silver Springs upstream. So the economics of science, it's very clear that restoration is something that will benefit Northeast Florida.
Well, and you and I went out on the boat for a story we did on the dam prior, probably 2 years ago, and what you were telling me, because they drain that swamp or the pond behind there.
Right.
When that happens, what happens to the river behind it is markedly different.
It truly is. So they have to draw it down every 3 to 4 years, kind of like a fishbowl, to clean it out because it gets invasive plants. They have to do a lot of herbicide spraying that adds insult to injury. But when they draw it down, it gives us a window into what restoration could look like, because the natural river, the natural historic channel of the Ocklawaha is still there. So you see that come into play. You see the stumps from the forested floodplain that were once there. So you can see just the magnitude of that forest that can come back. And literally cypress starts sprouting out during that short amount of time they do a drawdown, and the 20 springs that are lost underneath the pool, they start flowing. So you actually see the springs popping out. One of the local fishing guides was talking about doing a flyover during that time, and you see the blue springs popping up, which is something that will be magnificent to do, but it really puts it in perspective on how nature can restore itself, and not only restore the Ocklawaha, those 20 springs, but it's also critical for Silver Springs, the lower St. John's, and even the South Atlantic Bight, which is a very important saltwater fishery that depends on fresh water from the St. John's River ecosystem.
Do you guys have estimates on how long it would take to do that, what that construction would look like, how much it would cost?
Sure. So the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, it's their official stance that this restoration should happen. And their engineering plan and drawings estimates about a 4-year construction restoration effort, because there are some earth moving and there's some things that would have to be done, as well as managing invasive plants. But by breaching it just where you have that historic channel, it provides an opportunity to see the river come back. And so there's a big movement of restoration tourism where people actually come to see this type of project and then nature take back over. And so there's conversations about adding more recreational elements on the existing dam once it's breached, provide more areas for people to go fish in the restored river, as well as see this ecosystem all come back together.
Well, and one of the stories that I was just talking about was the safety of that dam.
Yes.
What's the potential threat?
Yeah, so the dam is a high hazard dam, meaning if there is a failure, it could cause significant environmental, economic damage and loss of life. And so there is very concern about it. There was a report that came out several years ago that said the condition of the dam is okay, it's in satisfactory condition. But if you look in the report, it also says, but we need to have a certified steel engineer look at the real condition of the dam during a drawdown to understand the true condition of the dam. And that survey has not been conducted to date.
Yeah. Well, there's so much more to talk about, even just outside of the dam, when it comes to what's happening in Putnam County and development along there that you may not know about, as well as some of the development downtown and how Riverkeeper stays on top of that. We'll get to that when we get back right after this break.
From CBS 47 and Fox 30, you're watching This Week in the 904.
Welcome back to This Week in the 904. I'm your host, Emily Turner. We are sitting down having a chat with the St. John's Riverkeeper. Thank you again for your time. We talked about what's happening in Putnam County with regards to the Rodman Dam, but right there is a huge project that a lot of people don't know about. Walk us through what it is and just how sweeping this could be.
Sure. Johnny Morris, who's the owner of Bass Pro Shops, he's actually owned a fishing cabin or fishing lodge, it's a beautiful lodge, in Willaca, and he's for more than 30 years. So has a very deep interest and desire to not only celebrate that area, but protect it. but also share it. And so he has brought 6,000 acres of land in the Willaca area. And it looks like there's not a whole lot of conversation about what's going to happen, but there's some rumors about that it's going to do a fishing destination to really highlight the bounty of the St. Johns River and the beauty of the area, because there is so much to do, whether you're into fishing, boating, looking at springs, going trails, bicycling, as well as you're near St. Augustine and downtown Palatka, which is just a thriving small town that has so much to offer, from restaurants to arts, antiquing. And so it's really going to be, I think, an ideal destination, similar to some of his properties in other parts of the country.
Is that something that the St. John River can sustain?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when you go out on the St. Johns, there's a lot of areas sometimes you don't see a boat. I mean, there's some secret areas. I know there's a lot of fishermen out there that may not want their secret fishing spots to be revealed, but I do think that there is an opportunity with all of our national parks in the area and places that already provide a good buffer to sustain this type of tourism. Obviously, any development has impact, so there is opportunity to make sure that we're doing that as sustainably as well and making sure it's protected. We have been out to visit some of Bass Pro Shop's other properties, and they really do celebrate the surrounding area, the history, as well as the ecology and nature and everything it has to offer. But at the same time, you do want to make sure we're keeping an eye on potential impacts.
Right. I've never been to one of their resorts. What are they like?
I was blown away by the Natural Museum, History Museum in the Branson area. Went with my family last year to check it out, and just really, walking back and understanding the context of the indigenous people that lived in these areas, as well as all the different, different animals and wildlife. And so really celebrates what makes these areas great. It is focused on fishing, and there are good ways to fish, there are bad ways, but really focusing on sustaining the fishery. Bass Pro Shops, they have a director of conservation, and so they really use science to help inform them. So we feel excited to see that Johnny Morris, who loves that area so much, I think he will not only want to celebrate it, but protect it as well.
Right. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And then further upriver, let's go all the way north, or downriver, I guess I should say.
Downriver, that's right.
It's the beauty of the St. Johns, we didn't know it flows north.
That's true.
It is in downtown. There are several lots that are set to be developed. One big chunk that is very much already being developed. Work along the North Bank. What is the challenge there when it comes to making sure that all the work that is happening right there still protects the river?
Sure. I mean, there's the whole focus on resiliency. After Hurricane Irma was a wake-up call for us. And so one of the things that we really focus on is when we do development on the river, we do it in a way that's not only sustainable for the river, but that helps us, prevent flooding and improves water quality. And so there are buffers that can be done. There's some buffers that we think are perfect. There's some we wish were a little better, but really focusing on making sure that in normal conditions that it's protecting and filtering out water quality that's running off into our river, and then in extreme conditions it's helping to absorb water. But there's also the construction time. During construction we see way too much sedimentation running off or dirt literally running off the sites. And we need to prevent that, because that adds another stress on our submerged grasses, because when you have too much dirt in the water, it can cloudy the water and prevent that much needed sunlight getting down. And so really making sure we keep the dirt in place, but we also use nature and plants, especially native plants that grow without fertilizer and supplemental rainfall, to really protect our river and make these public spaces as beautiful as they can be.
When it comes to the role of a watchdog, how much of that is Riverkeeper's job?
Well, it's kind of the buck stops with us. I mean, we are the main voice for the St. Johns River, but obviously one person can't do it all. We have a great team, but we also have members. We're a member-based organization, so we rely on our members for keeping an eye out and reporting things. We work with state and local agencies. One of my team members is out this week, sampling with the city of Jacksonville. So really helping all of us that play a role in being that watchdog, make sure we're doing our best. We try to negotiate better enforcement, and sometimes if we feel the enforcement's not going far enough, we will litigate. Right now we're using the Clean Water Act to help enforce stormwater permits off of industrial sites. And so we're using federal law to try to step up where we think the state's not doing enough to keep those permits in check.
How do you guys dovetail, the systems that are already in place with local government or Fish and Wildlife with what your mission is?
Well, I mean, you know, with fish and wildlife, that's easy. I mean, the same thing like fish habitat, it's so important, and we work with so many different fishing groups from CCA to Mighty River Recovery, which we were literally out in the river with last week installing these protective fences, because the fish habitat is the same thing that is the kidneys of the river. And so if you don't have that habitat for our bass, no grass, no bass, you have to have grass for our saltwater fisheries. That's real important, but also manatees, which is a threatened species. So we can use the Endangered Species Act to protect habitat for manatees, which in turn protects habitat for our fishery that also protects the St. Johns River. So it's all directly connected. So we can build better connections with all of these groups that have a different piece of this puzzle and work together. It gives our river a louder, stronger voice.
What is the challenge in today's political climate? The Trump administration, for example, has deprioritized environmental grants, for example. What is the challenge you face in navigating that?
You know, there's challenges on multiple fronts. One, we're seeing less dollars coming in for resiliency. A lot of these resiliency projects also help protect the St. Johns River from flooding, as well as providing that buffer that has the added benefit of water quality filtration. But also, we are seeing there's an attack on the environmental laws that are in place. So we're spending a big part of our time right now just protecting the federal and state laws that currently exist to protect our waterways. One is the Endangered Species Act. There is a conversation right now about taking out the habitat protection feature of that. If you don't have habitat, you don't have the endangered species. So we have to keep that in there, and that in turn helps us with all of our fisheries. So it's all hands on deck, you know, to protect those protections in place, but also to protect our St. Johns, its tributaries, and its springs.
And last question for you, for folks who might want to get involved or learn more, how can they do that?
Absolutely. You can follow us on our social media. All of these activities that we're working on, as well as events to get out and participate in, whether it's a cleanup or an advocacy event or an education program, you can find at stjohnsriverkeeper.org.
Awesome. Lisa, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you guys for sticking around with us this Sunday morning. Well, I'll be back next week with another episode of This Week in the 904.
Thanks for watching This Week in the 904.